In 1978, British Railways managed to generate a surplus of income over expenditure of £6 million, but only after receiving financial support from the government of £434 million. This support is to compensate the railways for providing what is considered essential commuter and rural passenger services. But from 1974, responsibility for rail services has lain with the metropolitan counties. In the case of the New Mills and Glossop services to Manchester Piccadilly, this responsibility lies with Greater Manchester. In 1980, the rail system in this county will run at a loss of £12 million, which will be met by this authority from the rates, since these services are regarded as socially essential. But the question is, why? Well, to answer this, we developed a framework of analysis that attempts to isolate the real social benefits and resource costs of maintaining such a service, in a situation where the market, through simple revenue and costs, is inadequate. The study we're going to look at in some detail was made in 1974 by Foster, when this line was chosen as an example of a marginal case for retention. But first it will be useful to describe the service that we're considering. The route has two patterns of service, one via Dry Bridge and Hyde, and the other via Reddish Redbury. The two lines join at Romiley, which has the highest population of the towns on the line. Taken with Redbury, it totals 29,000. The service then runs on to Marple, which has two stations. One, Rose Hill, on a short branch. Beyond Marple, the route runs on to New Mills, where the trains are turned back. The alternative road route is constrained by the natural barrier of the River Tame, and the main roads from the Marple area must pass either through Stockport or Denton. This constrained road system creates congestion costs, which represent the first major item in the attempt to estimate the true social costs of withdrawing these services. But why should we regard road congestion as a relevant consideration in our estimates of the value of a rail closure? After all, people will know how much the train or car journey will cost them, and will have evaluated the time the journey will take. Why should we now subsidise those people who are prepared to travel by train? Again, the answer lies in the failure of the market to correctly signal the real social costs of people's decisions. From your previous studies, you will know that the individual will equate the private marginal utility of the car journey with the private marginal cost. But the problem is that by making that road journey, every other motorist is slowed down, however fractionally, by the additional car. So the marginal social cost of this extra journey by car is going to be greater than merely the private cost when there's congestion. The greater the existing congestion, the lower existing traffic speeds, the greater will be the social costs imposed by the additional vehicle. Overall demand for road journeys will decline as the congestion costs increase, but the equating of this demand, reflecting marginal utility, to the private marginal cost will produce excess traffic flow. This flow will be lower if the interdependence or externality of the travel decision were related to the costs of travel. Ideally, this will be achieved by road pricing, raising the private cost to the social cost by imposition of an additional road tax. But such schemes have not been adopted, and therefore we can only turn to the subsidisation of rail transport as a means of raising the relative costs of road travel. In this case, the limited alternative road routes with their existing congestion make this an important factor in considering the economic case for continued subsidy. For 70% of the journeys made on this line during weekdays are made during the rush hours when congestion occurs. It is estimated that by 1984, an additional 23,000 car miles will be travelled each morning rush hour alone, with closure of the service. Foster estimates that the avoidance of road congestion accounted for £14.8 million and the discounted benefit of retaining the rail service. £2.4 million from the additional running costs of cars and £12.4 million from the increased journey times. Road users would not be the only people to experience a loss with rail closures from increased journey times. Former rail users will now have to transfer to other forms of transport. With closure of the line, an improved bus service would have to be provided, but it's unlikely that this will be as attractive. The longer journey time by bus is therefore also a cost imposed upon former rail users, and this was estimated as being worth £0.7 million. With the cost of providing this improved replacement bus service at £1.3 million for 39 additional vehicles. But not all former rail users will transfer to buses. Some will turn to private cars. It is estimated that 21% of former rail journeys will be made by car after closure. The direct running costs of these additional car journeys in fuel, wear and tear, etc. total £1.9 million. Finally, with more cars on the road, more accidents are likely. And given the type of road and the projected increase in the volume of traffic, accidents would cost society an additional £0.3 million. These benefits from the retention of rail service could then be compared with the savings that could have come from closure in 1972. Now, it's in the nature of railways that various services share the same facilities. They use the same track, the same signalling, and, as here at Piccadilly, the same station. In the case of the track, unless it can be reduced with the closure of the service, say to a single track, there will be no saving in this particular cost. With the New Mills Central service, it shares the main line to Sheffield, which is intensively used, and therefore removal of this service still involves retaining the track. Thus, this will not be an avoidable cost from closing that service. By contrast, closing individual stations which are not used by other rail services would be a saving both in staff and maintenance, and would be included, as of course would be the saving on railway vehicles and train crews. To an economist, what we're attempting to establish here is the opportunity cost of the resources used in providing these services. So finally, we can bring these figures together as our estimate of the costs and benefits of retention of the services from 1973 to 1997, discounted at 10.5% to establish present values. The road congestion costs imposed upon existing car users will be £12.4 million. The additional journey time cost for former rail users now using buses will be £0.7 million. The additional vehicle operating costs for existing car users will be £2.4 million. The operating costs of the replacement buses will be £0.9 million and their capital cost £0.4 million. The cost of substitute car journeys by former rail users who do not transfer to buses will be £1.9 million. And the accident cost £0.3 million. This gives a total of £19 million. But the avoidable costs from closing this service will be £6 million, giving a net benefit from retention of the service of £13 million. Foster also provided estimates of the net benefit with no improvement in the service and a closure in 1983, all at different discount rates, and all show a net benefit from retention. But we've not looked in detail either at the projection of passenger numbers or traffic flows, nor at the difficulties of giving values for journey time savings. These technical issues are beyond the scope of this programme. However, I will mention some of the aspects of rail closure that Foster was unable to take into account in his estimates of the social costs of closure. Firstly, there is the environmental impact of increased road traffic, with an increase in noise and vibration for those near main roads, and increased air pollution. In order to relieve this road congestion, it's likely that new roads will be built, and there are many reasons for believing that all the social costs of urban road building are not taken into account when road construction is authorised.
Secondly, there is the question of consumer surplus, which has not been considered in this study. As you know, unless there is perfect price discrimination, it will be the marginal consumer or passenger who will set the price for the service. All other passengers would have been prepared to pay a higher price for the service, but were not required to. Thus they obtained consumer surplus, benefit for which they did not have to pay. The railway only receives revenue equal to OBCP, although the benefit to the passengers from the service is really OACP. Thus the revenue alone fails to reflect the benefit of the service to the users of the railway. Some of this consumer surplus may be picked up in Foster's study from the higher costs which will be incurred from former rail users having to use private cars with closure. Nonetheless, it remains an important benefit of retention of a service that is missing from this study.
Finally, we must recognise the rail closures may have distribution implications for society. If public transport is mainly used by the poorer sections of the community, the reduction of subsidies, that is, the removal of resources, must be retrogressive in a distributional sense, assuming no other change in the pattern of public expenditure. Now, in this programme I've tried to illustrate with a practical example of a cost-benefit study of a suburban rail service in the Manchester area, how economists approach a situation where simple revenue and costs are failing to represent the real resource costs and social benefits of that service. In other words, how we might deal with a situation of market failure. But it would be wrong to give the impression that cost-benefit analysis represents an easy, unambiguous technique for evaluating resource allocation. Many of the detailed technical problems have only been alluded to in this programme, and some social benefits present almost insuperable problems of reduction to monetary values. Nonetheless, this approach represents a valuable source of information in the decision-making process, but it can only represent one input into a decision that must ultimately involve political value judgment.